The billionaire laughed at the janitor's daughter until she spoke 10 languages out loud and deciphered a manuscript that even the experts couldn't solve. The city trembled with its usual morning rhythm, a pulse of engines and footsteps weaving through the canyon avenues of Midtown Manhattan. The sun was not yet high, and yet the towers already glittered with a cold brilliance, their mirrored glass facades catching the day like knives. At the heart of this steel and marble kingdom, Richard Salinger's empire rose in dark majesty. Salinger Tech occupied an entire skyscraper, its upper floors a sanctuary for the man who had sculpted his fortune from lines of code and ruthless ambition. 51 years had carved no gentleness into him. Instead, they had etched the angular sharpness of a man who measured life by balance sheets and conquest. On the 52nd floor, the boardroom stretched like a temple of dominion. Black marble gleamed beneath polished shoes, each vein of stone like frozen lightning. The walls were adorned with canvases worth more than most neighborhoods, art not for inspiration but for intimidation. Picasso, Basquiat, Rothko, each piece a weaponized display of taste and access. At the center of the chamber stood a table of smoked glass, long enough to seat 24, but today set for one. Richard sat at the head, Patek Philippe shimmering on his wrist, the hands of the watch gliding silently across a dial worth $80,000, a timepiece that whispered a truth he adored. He was a man above time, above common limits. He leafed through a folder resting before him, its leather binding older than his company. Inside lay the object of his latest curiosity, or rather, his latest proof of superiority. A manuscript, yellowed and fragile, inherited weeks ago from an uncle he barely remembered. The papers bore strange markings, cascades of characters layered across pages like palimpsests. He recognized nothing of them, yet their very opacity pleased him. 5 translators, each a specialist with reputations that reached across universities and think tanks, had already failed him. Mandarin scholar, Arabic historian, Sanskritist, rabbinical philologist, Latin medievalist, all had shrugged after weeks of labor, confessing defeat before the text. Richard had paid each of them double just for the satisfaction of watching their pride crack. If knowledge itself could bow to his wealth, then even mysteries could be his to command. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs across the marble floor, and let the Manhattan skyline sprawl before him through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Below, the world hustled. Taxi horns, vendors, schoolchildren trudging through the last weeks of autumn chill. Far above it, Richard exhaled as though all of it were a stage built only to entertain him. He thought of his evening. Dinner at the Hudson Executive Club, where he and his circle of titans would laugh about markets, politics, and the theater of philanthropy. The manuscript might make a good anecdote there, a mystery that not even Harvard could pierce, now resting in the hands of Richard Salinger. The gods of money smiled on him, he thought. They always had. The glass doors at the far end of the boardroom whispered open. 2 figures entered, wearing uniforms of deep navy. Carmen Rivera, small in frame but solid in posture, carried her cleaning caddy with the quiet rhythm of long habit. Beside her skipped a lighter presence, Lucy Rivera, 12 years old, her hair a thick dark braid trailing down her back, her eyes already darting like sparrows over the massive room. They had come, as they did most evenings and some mornings, to dust, polish, and vacuum the shrine of empire. To Richard, they were barely more than background. Service staff, replaceable, anonymous, necessary like electricity or Wi-Fi. He watched them without expression, though something about the girl's energy drew his gaze longer than he expected. Lucy pressed her palms against the gleaming glass of the table, leaving faint prints that Carmen quickly wiped away with a cloth. The girl wandered, her eyes climbing the walls, lingering on the paintings, then on the shelves where Richard kept first editions and gifts from foreign dignitaries. She mouthed words silently, titles and names in languages Richard himself had never bothered to learn. Carmen hissed softly, urging her daughter to keep still, to work, to finish quickly so they could return to their small apartment in the Bronx. But Lucy was not built for silence. Curiosity pulsed in her the way ambition pulsed in Richard. "What is that?" Lucy's voice was soft, but it carried. She pointed to the manuscript spread across the table. Richard allowed himself a smile. Amusement at first. He tapped the edge of the parchment with a manicured finger. "This," he said, "is something that has stumped some of the brightest men in the world. A little relic, inherited, indecipherable. A puzzle no one can solve." Carmen froze, cloth in hand. She had worked too long in these high towers not to recognize the glint in a powerful man's eye when cruelty hovered near. She whispered, "Lucy, finish your task." But the girl didn't move. Her eyes, dark and steady, stayed fixed on the script. Richard chuckled. "You look like you want to try. Do you read?" His tone curled with sarcasm. "Of course you read. Everyone reads. But this, young lady, is no fairy tale. Not even your teachers could make sense of this." Lucy tilted her head. "What languages are those?" Her calm unnerved him. He expected awe, maybe intimidation. Instead, he received inquiry. He gestured dismissively. "Ancient gibberish. Mandarin, Arabic, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Persian, Latin. At least, that's what the experts tell me. None of them could do it." Lucy stepped closer. Carmen reached for her wrist, but Lucy slipped free. She bent over the manuscript, her braid falling like a curtain across her shoulder, her fingers hovering but not touching the brittle paper. Her lips moved silently, forming shapes, tasting syllables. Then, in a clear voice that carried across the marble expanse, she spoke. Not English, but a string of tones, measured and fluid, unmistakably Mandarin. Her pronunciation cut with the precision of a native speaker. She read a line, paused, then shifted seamlessly into Arabic, her tongue shaping the consonants with crisp ease. Richard's smile faltered. The girl continued, Sanskrit rolling from her lips like chant, then Hebrew with its dense cadence, Persian soft and lilting, Latin pronounced with the gravity of the medieval church. Carmen dropped her cloth. The sound echoed like a verdict. Richard's hand froze above his Patek Philippe, his pulse thudding. He had heard these tongues before in boardrooms, universities, lectures, but always filtered, always mediated by professors or interpreters. Never from a 12-year-old girl whose shoes barely touched the ground. Lucy finished the passage and looked up, her eyes not defiant but calm, almost gentle. "It's not 6 different texts," she said. "It's one idea told in many voices. Each paragraph repeats the same wisdom, but through the lens of each language. Like a mirror, but the reflection changes with culture." Richard's voice rasped before he controlled it. "What wisdom?" Her small shoulders lifted. "That wealth without dignity is poverty. That power is real only when it lifts others. Every culture here says the same thing. They wanted it preserved so no one would forget." Silence pressed against the marble walls. Carmen whispered her daughter's name as though to shield her. Richard's jaw tightened. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he felt the tremor of humiliation. Not public yet, but sharper for being private. A child had just unraveled what money and experts had failed to touch. Worse, she had used his own theater of dominance, this boardroom, to reveal it. He looked at her and saw not a girl but a mirror, one reflecting something he had spent his life suppressing. The skyline beyond the glass windows pulsed with neon as evening deepened. Richard forced a chuckle, but it came out brittle. "Remarkable. You've memorized some phrases, perhaps. A parlor trick." Yet even as he said it, the words betrayed him. The cadence, the fluency, no trick could counterfeit that. He felt the edge of panic, disguised quickly as laughter. "Perhaps you'll be the one to teach me, HM? Imagine that. Richard Salinger, student to a janitor's daughter." Lucy tilted her head again, the gesture small, unthreatening, but her words landed with a weight he could not shrug. Money doesn't measure intelligence. Real power is to lift, not to humiliate. The marble room seemed colder. Carmen clutched her daughter's shoulder, ready to flee, but Richard raised a hand, not in dismissal but in surrender. For the first time in years, the Titan of Midtown whispered words foreign to his mouth. "I apologize." The girl's gaze remained steady. She gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a truth she had always known. Then she turned back to her mother, ready to leave the shrine of marble behind. Richard stayed seated, staring at the manuscript that now seemed less like a trophy and more like an indictment. Outside, Manhattan roared, but within the 52nd floor, the silence of a man's fractured pride reigned. The boardroom's silence lingered in Richard's mind long after Carmen and Lucy had left. The marble walls, once reassuring in their polished permanence, seemed suddenly oppressive. He paced the length of the table, his hand brushing the glass surface as though seeking solidity. He told himself it was nonsense, a trick, an accident, some memorized recitation. Yet the echo of Lucy's voice in 6 tongues refused to fade. Worse, the message itself gnawed at him. Wealth without dignity is poverty. Power is real only when it lifts others. At home that night, Richard poured himself a glass of Oban's single malt and stood at the window of his penthouse, 30 floors above the East River. The city shimmered with its false constellations, office towers blazing, bridges strung with electric jewelry, Times Square flickering like a restless heart. He thought of his father, who had died long before Salinger Tech was born. A small-time accountant, George Salinger had preached prudence, hard work, and dignity, but Richard, restless even as a boy, had craved more. He remembered nights sneaking into the library at Columbia, drawn not to poetry or philosophy, but to textbooks on computing, economics, systems that promise scale. His father's words about dignity had seemed quaint, even weak. Wealth was power. Wealth was escape. But the manuscript his uncle had left him tied the past into a knot. Why had the old man possessed such a thing? Richard barely remembered him. An eccentric who traveled through Cairo, Beijing, and Rome, always with journals under his arm. He had dismissed him as a failure, a man too enamored of history to build a fortune. And yet the inheritance, this indecipherable puzzle, was the only object that had ever confounded Richard's empire of solutions. Now a girl, a janitor's daughter, had unlocked it in moments. Sleep eluded him. He thought of Lucy's eyes, dark but calm, carrying none of the defensiveness he expected. He thought of Carmen, shoulders tense as if bracing against the blow of his disdain. For years, employees, rivals, even senators had bent before him, careful of his favor. Yet the dignity of those 2 women, one working, one learning, had unsettled him more than any competitor's lawsuit. The next morning, his chauffeur drove him to Midtown as usual. The skyscraper loomed, familiar and hollow at once. He entered the 52nd floor boardroom and found the manuscript still lying on the table. He spread the pages out, running a finger along the flowing Mandarin characters, the angular Hebrew letters, the curling Arabic script. They were no longer decorations of mystery. They were witnesses. Richard's mind wandered back decades, to a memory he had buried. Himself at 12, not unlike Lucy's age, sneaking into the New York Public Library while his father worked late. He had loved the smell of books then, though he would never admit it later. He remembered a librarian who had taught him to pronounce a Latin motto carved into the stone arch: Lux et Veritas, light and truth. At the time, he had recited it proudly, but as the years passed, he replaced truth with ambition, light with the cold gleam of money. The echoes of the past rose now like ghosts. He poured himself into work that day, yet his focus faltered. He barked at assistants, dismissed proposals, stared too long at the city beyond the glass. That evening, when Carmen and Lucy entered again for their shift, he surprised himself by pausing. He almost called out to them, almost asked the girl to sit, to explain more. But pride still clung to him like armor. He watched silently as Carmen polished and Lucy carried trash bags, their presence a quiet reminder that not all power was written on balance sheets. The manuscript rested where he had left it, but its message was no longer dormant. It spoke from the past, from his father's stern voice, from the forgotten motto carved in stone. For the first time in decades, Richard Salinger felt the fault line of doubt crack through his marble confidence. The confrontation began not with words, but with Richard's silence. He had grown accustomed to the boardroom as a stage, his voice dictating, others reacting. But now he found himself hesitant, calculating, watching the janitor's daughter with a wary fascination. The next evening, when Carmen and Lucy arrived, Richard remained in the boardroom deliberately. He told himself it was chance, yet he lingered as if compelled. Lucy approached the manuscript without being invited. She looked at him briefly, then at the text, and began reading again, this time more slowly. The words unfurled in ancient tongues, but she translated them into English as she went, her young voice steady. He who hoards wealth, she read, builds walls around his heart. But he who shares knowledge builds bridges that outlast empires. Richard frowned. Pretty sayings. Fortune cookie wisdom. Lucy met his gaze evenly. Do you believe that? His instinct was to laugh, to crush her with sarcasm, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. Belief doesn't matter. Results do. Look around you. These walls, this tower, that's proof of results. Lucy tilted her head. Then why do you need the manuscript? Why hire experts? Why care if no one can read it? Her question cut through him. He felt Carmen tense, ready to scold her daughter for insolence. But Richard raised a hand to stop her. For once, he wanted to hear where this was going. I wanted to prove, Richard said slowly, that even the indecipherable can be conquered, that money can open any door. And yet it didn't, Lucy replied. The words struck like a verdict. Richard clenched his jaw. So you think you're smarter than scholars? Smarter than billionaires? Lucy shook her head. No, I just think wisdom doesn't belong to one kind of person. Not to rich men, not to professors. It belongs to whoever listens. The air between them thickened, heavy with the collision of pride and truth. Carmen, anxious, began scrubbing the same stretch of marble twice, her knuckles white. Richard exhaled sharply. You talk like you're twice your age. Where did you learn all this? The library, Lucy answered simply. Weekends. Volunteers. Free apps. Books no one touches anymore. Richard scoffed. You expect me to believe you taught yourself 9 languages at 12? Not by myself, Lucy said. Grace taught me Mandarin. Adam helped with Arabic. Mary gave me Latin and Italian. All of them volunteers. People who think knowledge is worth sharing. Her words landed with a quiet finality. Richard felt cornered, not by an enemy, but by an inconvenient truth. He realized, with a flicker of unease, that his first real confrontation in years was not with regulators, rivals, or shareholders, but with a 12-year-old armed with nothing but words. When Carmen and Lucy left that evening, Richard remained seated, staring at the manuscript. He felt both diminished and strangely alive, as though something had pierced the glass bubble of his empire. The confrontation was only beginning, but already the balance of power had shifted. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Richard had expected. He had intended the manuscript to be a private game, a display of his power over the scholarly elite. Instead, it became a mirror he could not turn away from. Each time Carmen and Lucy entered the boardroom, the balance of the room shifted. Richard, who once towered over everyone, found himself unsettled in the presence of a child whose calm intelligence dismantled his certainty piece by piece. On a late Thursday evening, the tension broke in a way Richard could not have anticipated. He had summoned 2 of his senior executives for a strategy session. The topic was mundane: quarterly reports, expansion into Southeast Asian markets. But the meeting was held in the boardroom, under the same black marble glow. Charts and projections covered the table when Carmen and Lucy entered to clean. Richard noticed immediately, though he pretended otherwise. The executives, both men in tailored suits, barely looked at the cleaning staff. To them, Carmen and Lucy were invisible. But Richard's eyes followed Lucy as she glanced at the charts, pausing just long enough for one of the executives to sneer. Careful, he said with a chuckle. Don't smudge the future with your fingerprints. Richard expected Carmen to flush, to rush her daughter out. But before she could, Lucy leaned over the chart and murmured something under her breath. It was quiet, yet Richard heard it. Your numbers are miscalculated. The projection for Q3 doesn't align with the growth rate of Q2. The room froze. The executive's smile faltered. What? Lucy pointed with a finger, hovering above the graph. Here, you added the percentage increase twice. It inflates the figure. Richard's executives looked at him, expecting a dismissal, a laugh. But Richard leaned forward instead, scanning the chart. His pulse quickened. She was right. A calculation error had slipped through, something that had escaped 2 vice presidents, an entire analytics team, and himself. The silence stretched. Richard felt a strange exhilaration course through him, a mixture of humiliation and revelation. For years, he had believed that money and position protected him from being questioned. But now, in front of his own lieutenants, a 12-year-old janitor's daughter had exposed a flaw in his empire's machinery. Leave us, Richard said abruptly to his executives. They hesitated, stunned. Now, when the door closed behind them, Richard turned to Lucy. How did you see that? Lucy shrugged. Numbers make patterns. If the pattern doesn't fit, something's wrong. It's like language. Richard stared at her, his mind racing. He had spent decades building walls of authority, but this was a reversal he had never imagined. A child who could dismantle not only ancient codes, but also the armor of his company's logic. For the first time, he did not feel threatened. He felt curious. "Teach me," Richard said quietly. The words startled him as much as they startled Carmen, who froze mid-swipe of the marble. But Lucy nodded simply, as though she had been expecting it. That night, Richard returned to his penthouse with a new energy. He found himself staring at the manuscript again, but this time he didn't see it as a trophy. He saw it as an invitation. For the first time in years, Richard Salinger was not the one holding all the power. The reversal had come quietly, unexpectedly, but it had already rewritten the rules of his life. Richard entered the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue for the first time in decades the following week. The great lions, Patience and Fortitude, sat in stone outside, watching as though they had been waiting for him. He remembered them dimly from childhood visits with his father, when the library had seemed like a cathedral. Now, walking through its marble halls, he felt the echo of that all return. Lucy guided him, her steps confident, her braids swinging. Carmen walked a pace behind, unsure whether this was folly or miracle. Richard had insisted. If he was to learn, it had to be here, where Lucy spent her weekends. They entered a small reading room, nothing like the boardroom's polished menace. Posters of alphabets hung on the walls, Greek, Cyrillic, Arabic. Cheap tables bore scratches and doodles. A handful of volunteers greeted Lucy with warmth. Grace Wong, her Mandarin mentor, Adam Haddad, who taught Arabic, Mary Romano, who juggled Latin and Italian. Each looked at Richard with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Billionaires did not frequent their circle. Lucy introduced him simply. "This is Richard. He wants to learn." The sentence carried no title, no wealth, no power. Just Richard. He felt strangely naked, but he nodded. Grace placed a Mandarin primer in front of him, the same kind she used for beginners. Adam pulled up a chair, offering patient guidance. Mary smiled faintly, as though amused that a man who commanded skyscrapers now stumbled over basic syllables. Richard felt the weight of division keenly. In his corporate world, his name commanded reverence. Here, it drew skepticism. He made mistakes, tones in Mandarin that twisted into different meanings, guttural Arabic sounds that caught in his throat. Lucy corrected him gently, never mocking, her eyes shining with a quiet authority. The alliances forming around him unsettled his old instincts. Grace and Adam encouraged Lucy, praising her skill as much as her patience. Richard realized that Lucy was not just a prodigy. She was the center of a community, one built not on wealth, but on generosity. He was an outsider, a novice. One evening, as he struggled through a passage in Mandarin, a message pinged on his phone. It was from a fellow member of the Hudson Executive Club. "Dinner tomorrow? We'll toast your Southeast Asia expansion. Don't tell me you're still obsessed with that silly manuscript." Richard stared at the message. For years, those men had been his allies, his mirrors. Together they mocked regulators, manipulated markets, and laughed at the expense of anyone weaker. Yet the words on his phone now felt hollow. The true alliance, he realized, was not in the club but here, in this scratched-up reading room, with volunteers who believed knowledge was wealth enough. When he didn't respond, another message came. "Careful, Richard. People are beginning to talk." He put the phone face down. Lucy looked at him knowingly, then returned to correcting his tones. The divisions in Richard's life were sharpening. On one side, the old alliances of power, prestige, and cynicism. On the other, the fragile but real bond forming with Carmen, Lucy, and the quiet army of volunteers. He felt the tectonic plates of his existence shifting, and for the first time, he wondered what would happen if he let the old world collapse. The reading room of the New York Public Library became Richard's unexpected classroom. Week after week, he returned, sometimes slipping in discreetly in the early morning, sometimes after work when the marble lions outside glowed under streetlights. The volunteers began to grow accustomed to his presence, though never quite comfortable. Some of them whispered about the billionaire sitting at their battered table, stumbling over tones and consonants. But Lucy treated him with no more deference than she would any other student, and that was precisely what made him return. One Saturday afternoon, while Carmen read quietly at a corner table, Richard sat across from Lucy with the manuscript spread between them. They had already deciphered several passages together, Lucy guiding him like a conductor. She insisted he attempt each language aloud. His Mandarin was clumsy, his Arabic halting, his Sanskrit heavy, but she did not let him quit. Again, she said firmly when his Hebrew pronunciation drifted. You can't rush it. Richard exhaled through his nose. I build a company that processes 12 billion transactions a day. You think I can't master a sentence? Lucy's lips curved in a small smile. You haven't yet. Her calm insistence disarmed him. In his boardroom, no one dared correct him twice. Here, correction was constant and oddly liberating. That afternoon, Richard asked the question he had been circling for weeks. Where did you really learn all this? I don't mean volunteers. I mean, how does someone your age hold 9 languages in her head? Lucy's brow furrowed. She set down her pencil, fingers resting lightly on the manuscript. Do you know what it's like when your mom works all night? When the apartment is too small to have quiet, and the only place that feels big enough is a library? Richard shook his head silently. Books don't care if you're poor, Lucy continued. They don't care if you have to sneak crackers from the food pantry for lunch. They don't care if you don't have a last name that makes people listen. If you open them, they give. Every weekend, I went to the language section. At first, it was just curiosity. Then it was power, I guess. A way to escape, to feel like I belonged somewhere. Grace, Adam, Mary, they didn't treat me like a child. They treated me like a student. That's how I learned. Richard leaned back, the edges of her words pressing into him. He thought of his own youth, sneaking into this very library for programming manuals. He had buried that memory beneath layers of marble and profit. Yet here was Lucy, holding up the same truth he had once known. Knowledge was freedom, not a tool for humiliation. Lucy tapped the manuscript. Do you want to know the secret of it? Why the languages are layered this way? Richard nodded. It's a puzzle, she said, but not one meant to be solved by experts. It's meant to show that truth doesn't belong to one people. If you only know one language, you see only a piece. But if you bring them together, the meaning multiplies. It's not about who can read more. It's about who can listen across differences. Richard felt the words settle into him like stones. Secrets revealed, not just of the manuscript, but of himself. For the first time in decades, he admitted aloud, I missed it. I thought money could buy the meaning. Lucy studied him for a moment, then shrugged softly. You can still learn. That night, Richard walked out of the library with Carmen and Lucy. The city was alive with horns and lights, but his thoughts were turned inward. Secrets had been revealed, and they were not in the manuscript alone. They were in the mirror Lucy held up to him. A reflection of the boy he once was, before marble walls and balance sheets had blinded him. The Hudson Executive Club sat on the top floor of a private tower overlooking the river, a sanctuary for billionaires, politicians, and power brokers. Its walls were paneled in mahogany, its chandeliers imported from Vienna, its dining tables long and gleaming. For years, Richard had felt at home here. Deals were struck over steaks, reputations built with cigars and scotch. But on the evening he returned after weeks of library sessions, the room felt smaller, almost suffocating. He sat at the table with 3 longtime associates, Douglas Winthrop, hedge fund king, Charles Redmond, media mogul, and Harold Klein, real estate baron. They clinked glasses and congratulated themselves on their latest exploits. But when Richard remained quiet, Douglas leaned forward with a smirk. You've been distracted, Richard. Whispers say you've gone soft. Spending evenings with janitors? Taking language lessons from a 12-year-old? Tell me it isn't true. Laughter rippled around the table. Richard felt the old instinct, to smile, to laugh along, to deflect. But the memory of Lucy's voice rose in him. Real power is to lift, not to humiliate. He set his glass down with a deliberate clink. It's true. The laughter stuttered, uncertain. Harold raised an eyebrow. You can't be serious. You're Richard Salinger. You built an empire. Don't tell me you're trading boardrooms for chalkboards. Richard's eyes narrowed. I've spent my life thinking power meant control, but a girl showed me it means something else. You call it soft. I call it necessary. Douglas leaned back, scoffing. Don't tell me you're going to start handing out scholarships and free lunches. You'll lose your edge. I'm already planning it, Richard replied. Scholarships, programs and libraries. Human dignity in my company culture. Carmen Rivera is my new director of human development. The table erupted in disbelief. Charles shook his head. You'll be a laughingstock. Shareholders will revolt. The club will cut you off. Richard inhaled deeply. The words should have terrified him. For decades, this club had been his fortress. But now, surrounded by velvet and cigars, he realized the fortress was a cage. He thought of Lucy correcting his tones in Mandarin, of Carmen finally smiling in relief when he offered her a real position. The contrast was stark. He leaned forward, voice low but steady. If being decent costs me your approval, then good riddance. I'd rather be a fool in your eyes than a coward in hers. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Richard rose, leaving his untouched steak on the plate, and walked out. As he stepped into the night air, the weight lifted. There would be no going back. The point of no return had arrived. The old alliances were broken, the old armor discarded. Ahead lay a road he did not fully understand, but for the first time, it felt like a road worth walking. News traveled faster than Richard expected. Within days of his confrontation at the Hudson Executive Club, whispers became headlines in business columns. Salinger Tech CEO abandons club alliances. Richard Salinger pivots toward philanthropy. Insiders baffled by sudden shift. Some praised the move, framing it as visionary leadership. Others mocked it as a midlife crisis. Inside Salinger Tech, the ripple effects were immediate. Executives accustomed to cutthroat directives now found themselves summoned to meetings about employee well-being. Richard announced a new initiative, scholarships for children of service staff and a partnership with the New York Public Library to fund language programs. He named it the Lucy Rivera Scholars Program, ignoring the stunned silence in the room when he explained its origin. Carmen, standing at his side, had tears in her eyes as he publicly introduced her as Director of Human Development. But consequences rarely align neatly. Shareholders grumbled. Analysts on Wall Street downgraded the company's stock, citing misaligned focus and philanthropic distractions. Old allies at the Hudson Executive Club cut Richard off from conversations, treating him as though he had contracted a contagious weakness. Invitations dwindled. In the office, too, there was resistance. One vice president muttered in private, "We're not running a charity. We're a tech empire." Another predicted Richard would be ousted within a year. Yet, at ground level, the reaction was different. Employees long silenced by fear found themselves daring to speak. A woman in HR told him, trembling, that for the first time she felt her work mattered. A software engineer approached him after a town hall, thanking him for creating a culture where dignity was not just a word in the mission statement. Richard moved through the days with a strange duality. Loss of prestige in the circles that once defined him, but gain of something he could not yet name. At night, he still sat with Lucy at the library, struggling over Mandarin tones or Hebrew grammar. The scratched tables, the soft hum of volunteers, the laughter of students. It became a rhythm more nourishing than mahogany boardrooms. The consequences also stretched into his personal life. Reporters camped outside his penthouse, eager for a glimpse of the billionaire turned unlikely pupil. One evening, as he tried to leave quietly, a journalist shouted, "Mr. Salinger, is it true a janitor's daughter is your teacher?" Richard paused, then smiled. "She's not just my teacher. She's my reminder that wisdom has no pedigree." The clip went viral. Praise poured in from educators, librarians, parents. But backlash struck just as hard. Memes mocking his softness. Op-eds predicting the downfall of Salinger Tech investors threatened lawsuits if profits slipped further. Richard realized, with growing clarity, that transformation was not a private act. Every step forward left ripples in a pond he no longer controlled. The consequences were larger, sharper, and far less predictable than he had imagined. Yet in the quiet of the library, watching Lucy's eyes light up as she corrected his tones, he decided the storm was worth it. The crisis reached its peak when Richard received an anonymous envelope at his office. Inside was a photograph, grainy, yellowed, decades old. It showed his uncle, the man who had left him the manuscript, standing in a crowded marketplace. Behind him, banners of Arabic script fluttered in the wind. On the back of the photo, a message was scrawled in a shaky hand. "You don't know the half of it. The manuscript is only a fragment." Richard stared at the words, his chest tightening. A fragment? He had assumed the manuscript was whole, a relic complete in itself. The idea that more existed unsettled him. He thought of Lucy, of her ability to see patterns he missed. He placed the photo in his briefcase and carried it to the library that evening. Lucy studied it intently. This market, see the architecture? It looks like Fez in Morocco. The banners are Quranic verses, common in the old Medinas. If this was your uncle's, maybe he was tracing connections across cultures, not just texts. Richard felt a pang of shame. He had dismissed his uncle as eccentric, a wanderer. But perhaps the old man had been a collector of wisdom, piecing together fragments across continents. The manuscript, then, was not just a puzzle but part of a larger mosaic. That night, Richard dreamed vividly. He saw his uncle bent over manuscripts in dim light, traveling through Cairo, Beijing, Delhi. He woke with sweat on his brow, the echo of Lucy's words lingering. Truth doesn't belong to one people. The buried truth was not only about the manuscript. It was about Richard himself. For decades, he had buried the memory of the boy who once sought solace in libraries, who once believed knowledge could free him. He had buried dignity beneath ambition, humanity beneath marble. Now those truths surfaced, raw and unrelenting. The next morning, at a shareholders' meeting, a confrontation exploded. One investor demanded, "Are we a company or a charity? You've tanked our stock for a janitor's daughter's fairy tale." Richard stood, the photograph in his pocket, and spoke with a steadiness he had never known. "For years, we built wealth without dignity. That is true poverty. From now on, Salinger Tech will build bridges, not walls. If that costs me your applause, so be it." The room erupted, some in fury, some in shock. But Richard did not waver. The buried truths were no longer buried. They had become his compass. That evening, as he left the building, Carmen and Lucy waited by the curb. Lucy handed him a notebook filled with her careful handwriting, translations, notes, reflections. "You'll need this," she said simply. Richard accepted it with a weight heavier than any contract he had ever signed. For the first time in his life, he was not following profit or prestige. He was following truth, wherever it might lead. Winter descended on New York with its sharp winds and gray skies. But inside the main reading hall of the New York Public Library, warmth radiated from shared purpose. Richard found himself there almost daily now, alternating between Mandarin flashcards, Hebrew psalms, and Latin conjugations. Carmen often accompanied Lucy, reading quietly nearby, occasionally glancing at Richard with something between gratitude and disbelief. But beyond the library walls, tension mounted. Salinger Tech's board of directors grew restless, stockholders impatient. Media outlets fed on the drama of a titan abandoning his marble fortress for wooden library tables. Business magazines speculated about his mental health, while op-eds debated whether his philanthropic pivot was noble or naive. Richard knew the confrontation was coming. The annual shareholders' assembly loomed only weeks away, and the pressure was unbearable. Friends who once toasted him now avoided his calls. Rivals circled like sharks. The Hudson Executive Club whispered openly about replacing him as CEO. One evening, as Richard struggled with a particularly complex passage of Arabic, Lucy placed her hand gently on the manuscript. "You can't keep living in two worlds," she said softly. Richard looked at her, startled. "Two worlds. You still want to please them," she explained. "The men in the suits. The ones who laughed at you. You can't carry their world and this one at the same time. You'll have to choose." Her words echoed through him like the chime of a bell. He thought of the manuscript's message. Wealth without dignity is poverty. Power is real only when it lifts others. He had memorized it in 6 languages, but living it, that was the harder test. Carmen spoke quietly from her corner seat. "If you do this, Richard, you'll lose them. The ones who never cared about you, only about what you could give them. But you'll gain something else. I've spent my life cleaning their floors. I know what dignity costs. If you're ready to pay it, then stand tall." That night, Richard walked home through Fifth Avenue, the cold biting his cheeks. He looked up at the skyscrapers, his own among them, and realized they no longer felt like monuments. They felt like cages. The confrontation ahead would not just be with shareholders. It would be with himself. He prepared relentlessly. Meetings with Carmen to shape humane workplace policies. Sessions with Lucy to refine the language of his speech. Late nights drafting a new charter for Salinger Tech that placed dignity at its core. Each word felt like a stone laid for a new foundation. The night before the assembly, Richard stood once more in the boardroom on the 52nd floor. The black marble gleamed beneath the lights. The art on the walls sneered with silent arrogance. For the first time, he saw it clearly for what it was, an altar to his ego. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, in Mandarin, then Arabic, then Hebrew. Power is real only when it lifts others. When he opened his eyes, the room no longer intimidated him. It was just stone and glass. The real confrontation awaited, and he was ready. The shareholders' assembly filled the grand hall of Salinger Tech's headquarters. Cameras flashed, journalists filled the back rows, and board members whispered nervously. For decades, these gatherings had been Richard's theater of triumph, where numbers dazzled and applause thundered. But today, the air carried tension sharp enough to cut. Richard walked to the podium without notes. Carmen and Lucy sat discreetly in the audience, though he could feel their presence like anchors. He began simply. For years, he said, we measured success by profit, by how high we could build, how much we could accumulate. But I stand here today to admit, wealth without dignity is poverty. Power is real only when it lifts others. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some scoffed, others leaned forward. I inherited a manuscript, Richard continued, that no scholar could read. I gave it to a girl, 12 years old, the daughter of one of our cleaning staff. She read it. She understood it. She taught me what it means to listen. That girl is Lucy Rivera. And because of her, Salinger Tech will change. Gasps erupted. Cameras clicked furiously. Board members shifted uneasily. Richard pressed on. Today I announced the Lucy Rivera Scholars Program. Already launched, already changing lives. We will fund education for children of working families, support libraries across the city, and ensure our workplace is one where dignity is not optional, but fundamental. Carmen Rivera will serve as our Director of Human Development to make this real. A shareholder stood abruptly. This is madness. You're turning us into a charity. Our stock has already fallen 15%. Richard met his gaze steadily. If your only concern is numbers, sell your shares. This company will outlast your cynicism. Because human dignity is not charity. It is strategy. A workforce respected is a workforce resilient. A community lifted is a market strengthened. This is not the end of profit. It is the beginning of purpose. The hall roared, some in outrage, some in applause. Chaos threatened to drown the moment. But Richard raised his voice, steady and clear. I will no longer lead from marble walls or mahogany clubs. I will lead from community. I will lead from dignity. If that costs me my crown, so be it. Better a crown of service than a throne of fear. The words hung in the air. Journalists scribbled feverishly, headlines already forming. Board members exchanged frantic looks. But Richard did not flinch. As the assembly broke into factions of protest and support, Richard stepped down from the podium. Carmen's eyes glistened with tears, Lucy's gaze steady with quiet pride. The moment of truth had passed. The future, uncertain and wild, had begun. Spring arrived in New York with soft rains and hesitant blossoms. For Richard, the change of season mirrored the transformation unfolding in his life. The chaos of the shareholders' assembly had given way to weeks of relentless scrutiny. Business commentators dissected every word of his speech. Rivals predicted his downfall. Yet beneath the noise, something steady had begun to grow. The first cohort of the Lucy Rivera Scholars Program was selected. 150 students from working-class families admitted into colleges with full support. Their acceptance letters arrived in bursts of joy across the city, in laundromats, cramped apartments, crowded kitchens. News cameras captured tears of parents, laughter of children, and Richard himself visiting the Bronx to congratulate families in person. For once, his presence did not inspire fear, but hope. Libraries across the city reported record numbers of students enrolling in free language classes. Within 3 months, 12 branches hosted programs in 15 languages, supported by 73 volunteers. Grace, Adam, and Mary became local celebrities, their works celebrated in profiles that praised the quiet heroism of teaching. At each library opening, Richard stood not as the patron but as the student, stumbling through a few phrases in Mandarin or Arabic, to the delight of the children watching. Inside Salinger Tech, change deepened. Carmen's promotion to Director of Human Development was more than symbolic. She implemented policies that shocked the old guard, zero tolerance for harassment, mentorship programs pairing executives with junior staff, language stipends for employees eager to learn. Employee surveys revealed an unprecedented surge in satisfaction, and turnover rates plummeted. Productivity rose, not through fear, but through respect. But the transformation came at a cost. The Hudson Executive Club expelled Richard quietly, without ceremony. Old allies refused to return his calls. Invitations to high society galas evaporated. He no longer received the nods of recognition in the corridors of elite power. And yet, when he sat in the library surrounded by children practicing strange syllables with laughter, he realized he did not miss it. 1 year after Lucy first read the manuscript aloud, Richard convened a press conference not in his marble boardroom, but in the library's grand reading hall. The room was filled with students, volunteers, employees, and reporters. Carmen and Lucy stood beside him as he stepped to the podium, no teleprompter before him. "I have lived most of my life chasing marble illusions," he began. "I believed wealth was measured in silence, in fear, in exclusivity. But a girl taught me otherwise. She showed me that wisdom has no pedigree, and dignity has no price. Today, I announce the creation of the Lucy Rivera Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $500 million. Its mission is simple: to bring education, languages, and opportunity to communities across America." Gasps filled the hall. Cameras clicked in frantic rhythm. Richard continued, his voice unwavering. "This is not charity. It is an investment in the only wealth that matters, the dignity of people. My boardroom of marble will become a round table for community. My empire will not be a fortress. It will be a bridge." When he stepped back, the applause was thunderous, not the forced applause of shareholders, but the genuine eruption of voices lifted by hope. Carmen wiped her eyes, overcome by the magnitude of what her daughter had inspired. Lucy, standing small but steady, gave Richard a nod that carried more weight than any shareholder's vote. That evening, as the sun dipped over Manhattan, the three of them stood by the window of the 52nd floor. But the room was no longer a shrine to ego. The marble table had been removed, replaced by a circular wooden one scarred by use, ready for discussions, for laughter, for community. Richard looked out over the city he had once ruled with cold pride. Now he saw it differently, not as a stage for conquest, but as a canvas for service. He turned to Carmen and Lucy. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. Lucy smiled, her eyes alight with certainty. Every language is a new beginning. Every student, too. Together they stood, no longer master and servant, billionaire and janitor, but allies in a vision larger than any one of them. Beyond the glass, Manhattan pulsed with lights and possibility. The story was not ending. It was multiplying, radiating outward in waves of opportunity. The lines of the library watched from Fifth Avenue, patient and steadfast, as if guarding not just books but the fragile, powerful truth that had changed a man, a company, and perhaps, in time, a nation. If you made it this far, leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from today and what you thought of the story. If you can, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to receive new videos. A big hug, and see you tomorrow.